in your most recent book, Roads of Excess. You talk about what amounts to almost a revelatory method that the historian of religion or the historian of mythology could utilize, which you discovered looking into your own past and your own secrets and gaining an empathy for your earlier work on Ramakrishna. Could you share something about that?
Yeah, essentially how I wrote the first book, the Collie's Child book. I think method and theory is something that you discover after the fact, essentially. You engage something in the field and then you get back and you figure out how it was you engaged it in the field. There were the obvious sorts of things in the first book, psychoanalysis, there was historical criticism, there was literary theory, there are all these other typical methods that we all use in the academy, but there was also a series of ecstatic and dream states that I had been experiencing for years in the seminary before that, and then in graduate school, and then they sort of all came to something of a head in Calcutta. And those were very influential in how I read the text as well. I didn't want to restrict my method to them because it wasn't a devotional work. But I did want to draw on those because I think as human beings we all share the same basic physiological and neurological makeup, and so we can use our own states to sympathetically understand other people's states. There are limitations to that, of course, but I think that's basically true.
When you're talking about this now, it sounds so academic and so non-threatening, but immediately one steps into the area of homoerotic mythology.
Right.
And it was shocking for me to read your analysis of your own religious pilgrimage and trauma.
Yeah. The basic story that I tell in Roads of Excess is of a young Catholic heterosexual male looking for an erotic mysticism that's heterosexual, and I frankly couldn't find one anywhere within my own Roman Catholic heritage. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of mystical traditions, and dozens of different erotic forms of mysticism, but for a male, they all at the bottom are essentially homoerotic because the divine is always male. There's really no way around that in Christianity at this point anyway. And that was an uncomfortable discovery for me in the seminary. It was a realization I didn't fit, and I couldn't fit, at least on that level. I'm sure millions of male Catholics are quite happy being Catholic because they don't try to integrate their sexualities into their religious life, but that's precisely what I wanted to do, and it just didn't work.
Now, is this kind of a reversal of repression of sex or suppression of sex? You're bringing up an erotic mysticism where you want it conscious, you want it integrated.
Yeah, I think it is. I think a lot of these traditions in the past were their attempts to integrate their sexualities into their religious life, but it could only be done. Maybe unconscious is the wrong word, but it could only be done on a symbolic level because these cultures would not allow homosexual expression. But they would allow homoerotic religious symbolism. So it's a kind of sublimation that takes place, and I think that's how we get these mystical traditions, by these sexualities that are marginalized or oppressed or suppressed or even persecuted in these cultures. And so they funnel in or they channel into other realms and become sublimated and become religious experiences.
And with this sensitivity to homoeroticism in your own tradition, you went looking for heterosexual or heteroerotic mysticism in Hinduism.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I did. And I did that because of the tantric traditions, which of the world's mystical traditions are not unique, but almost unique in really advancing a heterosexual aspirant. I mean, they imply heterosexuality, the divine is feminine, and the practitioner is male, and the texts are clearly written from a male heterosexual perspective, and that's why I got interested in these Hindu and Buddhist tantric traditions. And of course the great irony of the whole search is that I ended up with Ramakrishna, who I discovered after hours and hours of textual work was the mere opposite of myself. I was a heterosexual aspirant in a homoerotic tradition, i.e. Catholic bridal mysticism, and Ramakrishna was a homoerotic mystic in a heterosexual system, i.e. Shakta, Hindu Shakta Tantrism. And I think that's what ultimately gave me the insight or the conviction into the theses of Kali's Child, as I had suffered through something similar, not the same, but something similar in my own religious world.
Yeah.
And I never intended it to restrict it to one individual or one tradition. It's not my training.
One of the things that you picked up so beautifully in Roads of Excess was the personal history of the historians of mysticism, and both their struggle and their sensitivity toward their subject, prepared by some kind of trauma or a journey with the sexual that either they were conscious about and consciously had to defer or suppress or redirect, or were unconscious about. I saw lots of things as I read your book about my own work, but what did you find about the five historians of mysticism that you worked with?
Well, I found that they were often as torn and as conflicted and as passionate about the materials as we are. And I came to it wasn't a conviction I came to, I had the conviction when I began the project that people who study mysticism, particularly people who study erotic forms of mysticism, are doing that for reasons that are both intellectual and personal. You simply cannot separate those two in this field. Certainly, you can separate them in all kinds of other fields. Even in comparative mysticism, people study mysticism for all kinds of reasons, and I can well imagine the study of all kinds of mystical traditions that have nothing to do with sexuality or psychosexuality. But when you're studying these kinds of traditions that explicitly employ sexual language to talk about religious experience, and employ traumatic language to talk about religious experience, then you're dealing with sexuality, whether you want to admit that or not. That's what's working on one level of the text and in these people's lives.
There was a term that seems so innocent unless one has a psychological background, and it's disassociation. Innocently, I disassociate myself from my department as I start retiring, from a lot of the political intrigues that are there.
Right.
But you weren't using it that way.
No. Dissociation is a quasi-technical term used by psychologists and psychiatrists in trauma theory to talk about how the human psyche separates itself from traumatic context, from pain, from suffering, and it develops techniques essentially to split itself into two, or three, or four, or five, or however many. But it's a technique. It's a psychological technique that the brain uses all over the globe to deal with intense human suffering. And what I argue in the book is that this is something you see in the mystical traditions. The mystical traditions actually often provoke trauma. They encourage trauma. They inflict trauma in all kinds of ways, symbolic, ritual, And of course, in most cases, these mystics are coming from traumatic experiences in their own past. And those people who can dissociate, who can split their consciousness and go into these altered states to deal with traumatic contexts, can also, of course, dissociate for religious reasons and for more positive healing and artistic reasons. And I think dissociation is absolutely crucial to understand these texts.
Now, you imply two things. One, dissociation as a result of pain and suffering, and then dissociation for healing.
Yeah.
Now, in Kali's Child, there were a lot of moments that seem to imply dissociation when Ramakrishna.
Was in trauma.
The traumas.
Absolutely.
I think of the brothel scene.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Clearly in a situation of abuse.
Would you spell that out just a little bit?
Yeah, my argument, and this is something that people have misunderstood. My argument in Kali's Child is that Ramakrishna suffered a series of sexual traumas involving a whole line of figures in his life, and that it was these early cases of trauma in his young adulthood, particularly, during which he learned or perfected the psychological technique of dissociation. That's why when he's taken into a brothel and surrounded by naked women who manipulate him sexually in different ways, he goes into a trance. That's what human beings do in traumatic situations. Very often they go into trances, and that's what he did. That, of course, is interpreted religiously by the culture, because those are the terms they have, and they're reading back into this past event a much more positive, ecstatic state of the present. So there's some grounds for it. But what I argue is that he took that technique that he learned in traumatic situations and he used it for religious goals or ecstatic goals later in life. So what a technique that originally had a traumatic context is later used in a much more positive, much more ecstatic way later on in life. But they're connected.
Right.
They're very much connected, but they're not the same. And that's where I think some people have misread me.
Mm-hmm. But the book is filled with events that could go either way. I mean, he could have become a very, very dysfunctional person.
Absolutely.
Well, all of the events in his life.
Absolutely. He was dysfunctional in the early part of his life. The texts are crystal clear about that. The Bengali texts are filled with words describing states of pathology. He was mad, and they're very clear about that.
Use those terms specifically.
Absolutely. And he came through that and came to some degree of healing through his sadhanas and his visionary experiences, and that's really the glory or the accomplishment of the man and of those texts, is they work through that stuff and arrive at something quite beautiful and positive at the end.
And I think that's what anyone reading your book conscientiously finds, that you praise that.
Yeah.
And you show the extraordinary journey through these periods of immense suffering to an accomplishment.
Right.
And what was that?
Well, the accomplishment works, I think, on a number of levels. It's the deepest accomplishment is a genuine sublimation, a making sublime of these original sexual traumas into ecstatic states that I think very likely accessed some sort of ontological or metaphysical level. I mean, I leave that question open because we can't know that. There's no way to really know that. But there's also no way to really not know that, or to say that it was just sexuality. I think the ontological question is the real issue here. But I think the real accomplishment is, at least in terms of his own cultural categories and his own self-understanding, there really was a successful sublimation there. He really moved from a state of early trauma to a state of later religious and cultural accomplishment that his peers recognized as quite astonishing. And we still recognize today as very significant. So it's a kind of making sublime, sublimation. And of course then the cultural accomplishments of forging an effective response for the time to the Christian missionaries, to the colonial challenge. And there's a whole set of accomplishments that then get picked up by his interpreters, particularly Vivekananda, and develop from there. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole string of accomplishments.
Let me ask a question about male homoerotic mythical structures or structures. Are they phobic?
You mean, are they misogynist?
Phobic of the opposite sex, and yes, eventually are they misogynist?
I think they can be. I think they often are. I don't think they need to be. I think it all depends on the context. I think a lot of mystical literature, maybe most mystical literature, is definitely misogynist. It demeans the female body as a place of impurity and temptation, evil even sometimes, and that's misogyny. That's what we mean by misogyny. I think ascetic traditions in general tend towards misogyny. There's any question about that. Do they need to? No, I don't think they need to be. I think you can have an ascetic or celibate tradition that is celebratory or affirming of both genders, but we don't really have that yet anywhere. I think our forms of feminist and gender consciousness are modern accomplishments, and I don't think you can find them in the past.
Now, let me back up a second. Did I hear you say mysticism in general is misogynist?
No, I said mystical literature commonly is misogynist.
Because men write it.
Because men write it, and the way you get many forms of mystical tradition is through the repression of sexual energies. And one really good way to repress sexual energies is through the rejection of women. And in most of these cultures, homosexual expression is not allowed. And if you demean feminine sexuality and heterosexuality, you've just eliminated two major options there, and the chances of repression are very great, and so the chances of sublimation are quite good as well. And this is why I think the mystical literature is filled with misogynistic statements. That, and it's written very often by men who, in our own terms, are homosexually oriented. And I think when they often demean women, it's not that they hate women, it's that they love men, and women become the way they are forced into a heterosexual existence. I mean, imagine what it's like being a homosexual man in a culture in which only heterosexuality is normative, and every man must become a married man, or a householder, or what have you. Those sorts of people are going to be very negative about women and about family life, because it essentially denies who they are. They have to deny the basic facts of their physical existence to fulfill the customs of their particular culture. So they're going to be misogynistic on some level, but it isn't necessarily some sort of condemnation of women per se. It's a function of their homosexuality, which has no adequate expressions in the culture. What they're rejecting isn't women, it's heterosexuality is what they're rejecting.
Now, besides the enormous implications that your work has had on mystical studies, aren't there some implications about previous interpretations about asceticism?
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm saying here, is that I think very often ascetic practices or renunciation in a traditional Indian term really, in many cases, it's a homoerotic option or expression. It's a rejection of the life of the heterosexual householder or the heterosexual male, and it's an option or a choosing of an all-male, same-sex community that attempts to sublimate these energies into religious experience. I think same-sex communities are exactly that. They're same-sex communities. They're bound together through homosexual energies.
But what asceticism is there in this homoerotic practice when one is not actually renouncing anything that one would want to?
Yeah, that of course is where the traditions, I think, become a bit dishonest. What does it mean for a homosexual man to renounce or give up the married life, or a woman? Well, it means very little in terms of giving up something or sacrificing something, but it means a great deal too. It means the person is rejecting the cultural demand that he be heterosexual, and he is affirming his own sexual existence as someone who is not heterosexual. So it's a kind of bold statement, but it's certainly not a giving up of something he wants. It's a giving up of something he doesn't want, but which his culture wants him to want. That's what's happening.
Well, now that you're beginning to reveal this secret, not only in the West as a Westerner, but you're revealing it as a Westerner to India, how is this message being received?
Mixed. That's the positive way to put it. Very poorly might be a more honest way to put it. First of all, I think my work is just one piece of a much broader puzzle. There are thousands and thousands of human beings working on these issues in the academy, and perhaps more importantly, in the streets and in the cities and in the religious communities, both in the West and in India. I did not get into these issues. I certainly did not choose to write on Ramakrishna for political reasons or even ethical reasons. I was really on my own religious quest, just to try to understand how sexual mysticism works. That's really was my goal, and that's really still my goal.
And you chose a great figure.
I chose a magnificent figure. But one of the outcomes of that quest was my realization that these intellectual questions have deep political and ethical significance. And that's something that it's taken me years to accept. I'm still not, frankly, that comfortable with it. But it is the case. And I think those political or ethical dimensions explain very well why my work is accepted in some quarters and rejected in other quarters. I don't think it has really anything to do with the work itself. It has to do with the political and social context, and whether that context is accepting of homosexuality or not. That's really the bottom line. And of course what complicates that further is the fact that I'm a white guy from Nebraska. I'm not an Indian. That creates all kinds of emotional and political connotations in a post-colonial world, particularly in India that suffered through this, we all know, centuries of colonialism. And I'm very much aware of that. And I'm very conflicted by that. But again, I do not share the convictions of that colonial past. I do not share the missionary strategies of my own tradition. And I did not get into this for any of those reasons. And the real irony, of course, here, I was first exposed to these things by Hindu missionaries in the West.
Exactly.
So the missionary activity works both ways, and I'm very, very happy those Hindu missionaries came to America and brought these texts here. But I see no reason why I can't respond to them with my full heart and mind and body. And I simply reject the notion that that's somehow essentially colonialist or imperialist or whatever bad word you want to throw at it. It's simply an American responding with all of his being to a religious tradition that is now an American religious tradition, and a tradition he loves. That's what's at work here.
When I've read your writing, there is a wonderful empathy that you have for the gay community. And one of the ironies is that those who criticize you from one area are constantly calling you gay.
Mm-hmm.
How are the various different homosexual communities responding? Indian homosexual communities, Western homosexual communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I only know what people share with me.
Right.
People write or share with me. But my general impression, and it's certainly not a universal impression, is that, of course, the gay, bisexual, and lesbian communities have very little trouble with the work. Quite the opposite. It gives them a very powerful way to talk about homosexuality in Indian history. And certainly the Western gay communities. I mean, my first essay, my first major essay, the Ramakrishna's Footpiece, was published by the Gay Men's Group in the American Academy of Religion.
And that was the first one I read when you were still a graduate student.
Yeah, and it was very well received among them. I mean, I maintained very close contacts and very treasured contacts with the gay community, because we share a lot of the same interests. And I simply reject the notion that you have to be gay to study gay history. That's ridiculous. And I think, quite the contrary, I think particularly a field like gay and lesbian studies, or women's studies, or any other similar study that has a liberatory aspect to it, you need people in it who are not identified with that particular position physically. I mean, you need men in women's studies to enrich the field and to challenge it and to take it in new directions. And you need straight people in gay and lesbian studies. I think that's obvious, and I'm rather shocked when I hear otherwise.
You're already on, okay. Jeff, how is the Indian community, especially the homosexual community in India, read your work?
Yeah. Well, again, I only know what people have told me, what people have shared with me. My general sense is that the book has not been widely read in India, because it's available, but it's very expensive, of course, by Indian standards. It's widely known about, but the things that are known about it often, I think, are quite inaccurate. It's suffered considerably over the last 5 years in the Indian press, and has gotten very little, what I would say, fair press. Which is not to say that many Indians have read it and have appreciated it. I have very thick files of letters from Indians about my work, and that's been very rewarding. But I think in general it's fair to say that at least the public reception of the book in India has been quite negative. It's been the object of 2 ban movements now and a letter writing campaign, so it's not been a positive experience on that front.
You touched a nerve that might be characterized as you said something bad about Indian holy men.
Yeah, I think that's the general.
And you said something bad about them being sexual.
That's right. I think that's clearly the perception. The perception is that because I have talked about sexuality and homosexuality in the context of a great Hindu saint, I must be attacking him.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reasoning, the line of reasoning that takes place, I think, in the public in India. What, of course, is missed there is that I don't consider sexuality or homosexuality to be bad or negative in the least. So to talk about these things in the context of a Hindu saint, from my own Western perspective, is an eminently positive thing to do. It's a kind of recovery or revisionary history. But in a social context in which homosexuality is condemned or not allowed, it's perceived to be an attack, which it is not. And I think that's the real sort of misunderstanding that goes on back and forth. And I certainly regret that. I'm not sure what I could have done about that or what can be done about it today, other than continual dialogue and for more Indians to actually read the book. I think most of my vociferous critics haven't even looked at the book.
There have been some critics that have read your work, and they have attacked you vociferously in ways that are unusual for an academic either to be read that way or to provoke such angry responses. Could you characterize a few of those?
Yeah, I think, again, I think I already have in some ways. I think the anger comes, it's a kind of projection, really. It's their condemnation of homosexuality being projected onto me as a condemnation of Ramakrishna. And I think that it's exactly that. It's a projection. It's a misreading of me. It's a profound misunderstanding. The most creative criticisms that I've received have been philological. In other words, in terms of translation issues. Swami Tyagananda wrote a 124-page response to the book, and a psychoanalyst from Calcutta wrote a response, and another Swami of the order wrote an essay years ago in response. And I took these things very seriously and very appreciatively. The fact is, there are errors in the book. There are translation errors in the book, which I did not know about. It's a 400-page book. It treats about a 3,000-page corpus. There are thousands and thousands of lines of translation incorporated into it. And you're going to make mistakes when you talk about that volume and working with a language that is not your own. And I do not pretend to be fluent in Bengali. I studied it for 8 or 9 years and feel very comfortable with the text, but I make mistakes, and I've always openly acknowledged that. I've quickly apologized for my mistakes, and I'll apologize for these and correct these. My basic response to those issues, though, is that they concentrate on a few twisted branches and broken twigs in a very large forest, and they miss the forest. And I could easily go through and tape up, fix up, or just cut off the broken branches and the broken twigs, and the forest would remain the forest. In other words, I could respond and correct all of these errors, put out a third edition, and the reader would read the third edition as he or she read the second or the first. They wouldn't even notice.
In the second edition, the philological mistakes that you acknowledge so graciously and fixed didn't change a thing.
Of course not. No. Because ultimately, the issue is not about philology. I've made errors. They're not major errors. Those can be changed. The thesis remains. The basic thesis is completely untouched. And that's the real issue. And what the philological criticisms attempt to do is draw attention away from the larger theses and focus on these minor points, which are really at their base that sort of ad hominem argument that Jeff can't translate, he's a bad translator, he's intending to deceive, etc., etc. None of which is true. But it's a technique to draw away from the book and to delegitimate the author and the work.
I've seen a few of the criticisms. None of them would even begin to say that Ramakrishna had no traumas.
Right.
He was dismissed from serving as a priest at periods. Isn't that correct? Or relieved of his duties.
Right, that's correct.
By the temple manager, Mathur.
Yeah.
That's not corrected by any of your critics.
No, of course not.
Other of the traumas that you point out, no one addresses those.
Yeah.
So a few words here and there that could be translated differently.
Yeah.
They've addressed those.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the abuse side or the trauma side or the suffering side.
Yeah.
And then from that, the discovery
Yeah.
of the kind of homoerotic, disassociative symbolism that you've discovered. I've not seen anyone address that with any...
No, of course not, because that thesis, I think, is unassailable. I think once you understand the terms of the thesis, you understand what I'm saying, I honestly, I think it's impossible to argue against. It's so obvious. But those terms are either not understood or they're not accepted as such, and therefore the thesis does not become obvious.
Well, I think that's why your second book, Roads of Excess, or...
Roads of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom. Yeah.
Yes, and the second part is even more important than the first, but
Right.
the first part is going to illustrate what you were doing
That's right.
in College Child.
Yeah, one of the things, one of the intentions behind writing the Roads of Excess book was to show, it was written for lots of people. It was written primarily for my students and my correspondents that I've come to know and be very fond of over the years, who read College Child and through it developed a very close relationship to me. It's primarily written for them, but it's also written for my critics, who I deeply respect and feel a duty to respond to. And what the Roads of Excess book does is it attempts to show that this isn't what I think just about one 19th century Hindu saint. This is what I think about mystical traditions pretty much across the board, comparatively. This is what I think about my own religious tradition. This is what I think about myself. I take the same methods that I apply to Ramakrishna in Kali's Child, and I turn them back on myself in the Roads of Excess book, because I think they work just as well. I think they work every single time you have enough information about an individual or a mystic. These methods work. We can say a great deal.
Now, Roads of Excess, you begin to develop some comparative methods that revealed a great deal about what you had done in College Child.
Right.
Would you elaborate on that, especially with the French historian of Islamic mysticism?
One of the things that I've found writing is that I really don't know what I think until I write it out. You sort of learn what you think by expressing it on the page. And so what I wanted to do in Roads of Excess was figure out how I came to the conclusions I did in Kali's Child, and how I came to those conclusions in a larger comparative context, because, as I said earlier, I was trained as a comparativist, not as an Indologist, and so I think comparatively. I don't think about just Hinduism. I think about Hinduism side by side with Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Taoism and everything else. It's all sort of in a pot together, boiling. What I did in Roads of Excess was I essentially developed the homoerotic method that I had used in Kali's Child to look at these other mystical traditions. But not just at the mystical traditions themselves. What I was more interested in was the scholars themselves, because it was my conviction that we come to our deepest insights, we come to our best ideas through a deep personal engagement with these religious traditions. We're not doing a science. This isn't a science. We're not manipulating chemicals in a test tube or studying statistical relationships among a bunch of numbers. We're interacting, we're imbibing, we're becoming the texts and the people we study, because we're human beings, we're not computers. And so that interface, or that dialectic between the scholar and the object of study is really what I was interested in, and that moment of union between the scholar and the subject of study is sort of the mystical point of scholarship. It's what I called the hermeneutical union of the act of scholarship. And so what I did in the Roads of Excess book is I looked at that hermeneutical union, or that process, in these 5 different individuals. And in many ways, I think the Massignon case is the most revealing and the most powerful, really, in some ways. And in other ways, it was the closest to me, because Massignon was a very pious, committed Catholic his whole life, studying Islamic forms of mysticism, really a single mystic in some ways. Some people have said he only wrote one book, this magnificent 4-volume, The Passion of Al-Hallaj. That's actually not true. He actually wrote more books than that, but that was his magnum opus. And so I looked at Massignon and again found most of the patterns that I had seen elsewhere, i.e., in this case you have a homosexual scholar. That's not debatable. That's not even an issue. He was very clear about that. His family is very clear about that. That's just not even an issue. And he attempts suicide, very much like Ramakrishna attempted suicide, at about the same, roughly the same age. And he has a profound mystical experience attempting suicide, again, very much like the Ramakrishna case. And again, very much like the Ramakrishna case, the attempted suicide is clearly over his homosexual orientation. That's why he was trying to kill himself. And his conversion back to Catholicism was really a conversion away from homosexuality to a kind of forced heterosexuality. And my thesis in the chapter is that his fascination with Al-Hallaj, who was crucified for his love of this male god, was a kind of thickly described, or a kind of rich place where he could struggle with his Catholicism, where he could struggle with his relationship to Christ, where he could struggle with his homosexuality, and where he could interact with another religious tradition, in this case Islamic Sufism. The real paradox of that chapter for me, the real sort of poignancy of the whole book, really, is the realization at the end of that chapter that to recognize that Massignon's sanctity, that his energy, his sort of palpable holiness that people felt around him, was a product of, at least on one level, repressing rather violently his most basic sexual impulses. He sublimated his homosexuality into a Catholic sanctity. And for me, as a thinking person, certainly related in some way to Catholicism still, I have to ask the question, what happens when we no longer condemn those sexualities? What happens when we sacralize them and make them holy and encourage them to be expressed? What then happens to those sublimated forms of sanctity that we've based the tradition on in the past? And the answer, of course, might be that they go away, that those forms of sanctity become psychosexually impossible, because you're expressing those energies now with other human beings. You're not locking them up inside and sublimating them towards a divine object. You're expressing them in a human relationship. And that's really the answer I come to at the end of Roads of Excess. I really opt for what I call a mystical humanism, and a choice or a decision at the end of the path, or in the middle of the path, wherever it is we are at the moment, to love human beings and not to reject them for some sort of divine object or theological construction. And I think that's probably what troubles me most about the history of religion, is this consistent pattern of rejecting or harming or even killing human beings for the sake of some theological idea that's really just an idea. It's in our heads. It has no objective existence that we can tell out there. And yet we engage it as if it did, and we harm each other. We kill each other. We've done it for thousands of years. History is bloody and strewn with corpses that are a direct result of our religious beliefs. And so it's ultimately, I think at the end, it's an ethical conclusion for me. And it's an opting for human beings over the gods.
It's a very challenging ethical conclusion.
Yeah.
Because it challenges repressed sexualities and repression disguised as purity or sanctity. But you talk about some kind of struggle that in the past very often has pitted mysticism against ethics.
Right.
You talk about either integrating them or holding them side by side.
Right. Yeah. Another one of my strong opinions or convictions is that there's no necessary connection between mystical experience and ethical behavior. I think the history of mysticism shows that convincingly. That's not to say that ethical behavior cannot be associated with or attached to or made an intimate part of mystical experience. That certainly has happened as well. But there's no necessary connection there. You can be a great mystic and a lousy human being. I think that's just apparent. And I think that's painfully obvious, particularly today when we have access to the personal lives of a lot of great mystics. And a lot of their personal behaviors are quite troubling, to say the least. And so I guess the conclusion I come to in the Rhodes book is that there's no necessary connection there between the two. And therefore, any mystical path that wants to be relevant to today's world or to our own humanity has to have an ethical critical component to it. It has to be able to subject itself to ethical criticism. If it can't do that, it's really not worth it in the long run. It might generate some profound religious experiences. It most likely will, because of course unethical behavior often results in trauma and in people dissociating. That's what it does. But is that something we want to sacralize now? I don't think so. I don't want to sacralize that. Because again, I'm opting for the human beings over the states of dissociation.
There was a bit of an irony, wasn't there, that India would be debating your book or the banning of your book, Kali's Child, while you were
teaching it at Harvard. Yeah, that's in fact what happened. Last spring, the book was in fact debated in the lower house of Parliament in India while I was teaching it at Harvard. And it's something schizophrenic about that, to be quite frank. And I'm not sure how to even put those two things together, or even if I should put them together. But it really captures well the experience of the book for me over the last 5 years. There's this ecstatic enthusiasm that has received it in some quarters, both in the academy and in India. And then there's this other sort of phobic, angry response that is met in other quarters. And they're both real. They're both there, and they're both responding to the same book and to the same set of ideas. And I think both responses are important. And I think one response, the angry response, issues from a kind of homophobia, a fear of homosexuality, and maybe even a fear of the West. And the other response issues from a kind of a deep appreciation of homosexuality and the body and sexuality in general, and a celebration of that. So they're two opposite responses to the same set of ideas, reflecting the emotional lives of the people who are reacting. Certainly not reflecting me. I clearly land in the celebratory or affirming camps. I guess that side reflects my own intentions. And that's actually what was so rewarding for me about Harvard, was I saw that in my students. I saw my own motivations. I saw my own sense of self reflected accurately for the first time in a set of readers. It's something I haven't had on a wide range in the past.
Was there any particular thing at Harvard, among colleagues, among students, in the classroom, that symbolizes this year of reflection, this year of trying to knit together all the desperate aspects of your work and what has been going on?
There were lots of individual experiences in the classroom, lots of symbolic moments, many conversations in private in my office between students that taken together, I think, were very powerful experiences for me and for the students. But I think it's the whole. I think it's the students as a whole and the response as a whole. I certainly did not dwell at any center of Harvard Divinity School for the year. In terms of the faculty, in terms of the school, I was just another visiting appointment coming in and coming out. But for the students I had, I think it was much more than that. And there were a lot of relationships and professional relationships there developed, and I think will continue through the years. I think the fruit of that will be long range, and certainly not something that ended when I left last May. At least I hope not.
In wrapping things up, because we have covered so many issues, I'd like to turn to one that might be prophetic. I think your work, besides its contribution to mysticism, is a major contribution to religious studies methodology. Mm-hmm. And it would probably be better in your own words than in mine, because we're just beginning to learn that from you. So I'm asking a question about how you perceive your contribution to methodology.
Yeah. I was trained in the history of religions, which really has a kind of dual heritage. You have this Enlightenment heritage coming through people like Hume and Marx and Freud and Durkheim, which is a hermeneutics of suspicion, or a kind of reduction of religious phenomena to non-religious phenomena, whether that's economic or psychological or social. And I think that's a precious heritage that we do not want to give up. I think it's crucial. On the other hand, we have what you might call this hermeneutical heritage coming through Schleiermacher and Dilthey and into the modern period with Habermas and Gadamer and Ricoeur and Eliade and Otto and all those sorts of people. And what I attempted to do in the Rhodes book again was to bring those two traditions together, not to deny either, and to see what happens when you sort of spiral them together. I mean, the image I developed in the conclusion was a spiral that works through centrifugal and centripetal forces, and it gets tighter and tighter and more piercing as it goes up. And I think that's what on some level, what we need in the academy today is a combination of those two heritages. I'm absolutely delighted that there are people working in the Enlightenment paradigm who are fervent reductionists and profound critics of religion. I think we need those. I'm also happy for those who are working in the hermeneutical tradition. And I think the academy and the culture as a whole will be healthy as long as both camps exist and can keep talking and yelling at each other. If either one of those camps wins or dominates, I think we'll be upward for it. And what I was trying to do in the Rhodes book is combine those and show how they can come together in a single life. My life, which is the only life I have any immediate access to. And how then those methods focused in a particular life, in a particular kind of honesty, can produce insight into history and into the study of religion. And I really think that's what it comes down to, is a kind of honesty, just saying what you see and not allowing people to shout you into silence or to say that you can't say that or you can't think that or you can't do that. You know, those are attempts to censor. That's really what it boils down to. And I think what we need now is just a kind of open, public honesty. This is what I see. This is what I think. I didn't want to see these things. I didn't want to know these things. I didn't go into the field saying, gee, I want to write a book that they try to ban twice and people hate and love. And well, that was not my goal. I would be very happy to be ignored at this point. But those were my conclusions. Those are my honest conclusions. They are still my honest conclusions. And I think as long as we stick with our own intellectual and religious integrity, we'll be fine. But the moment we allow political or social or religious forces to silence us or to scare us or to shout us into silence, I think we're lost. And I think that's what the Rhodes book is about on some level.
Well, as a senior member of the American Academy of Religion, I don't think I overstep myself when I thank you for the American Academy of Religion. I reviewed your book before it was even in print because I had a copy of your dissertation, and we had communicated, you said there weren't going to be too many changes when the University of Chicago Press published it. And at the time, I saw it as a methodological breakthrough and one of the most exciting theses that I had read in religious studies to that point in my career, and still to this point. So I want to thank you for the courage to speak out. I don't know if you knew all of the things that were about to happen to you.
Of course I did. There was no courage. There was naivete there, that's all.
And you stepped blindly
That's
into
right.
that.
That's right.
And I hope you continue to speak out with courage and integrity as you have done. Thank you very much for all you've contributed to religious studies and to our understanding.
Well, thanks, George. And of course, the glory of the Academy is that half of it would disagree violently with everything you just said. And that's what we should be about. So thank you. Okay, we're done.